The cruelest fate is not being rejected once, but waking up with the memory of everything you already lost. The bells of the sacred mate ceremony echoed across the moon court, each solemn note carrying the promise of destiny. Thousands had gathered beneath banners of crimson and silver, filling the marble terraces that overlooked the sacred circle where wolves had sworn their bonds for generations. Every eye was fixed on the towering figure of Alpha King Magnus Valen. Clad in polished black royal armor scarred by countless battles, his heavy crimson cloak drifted behind him like a river of blood beneath the morning breeze. A sword rested against his side, and his expression remained unreadable as always, cold enough to silence an entire kingdom with a single glance. At the opposite end of the sacred platform stood Maeve Ashford. Her simple sage-green dress fluttered softly around her ankles. Unlike the jeweled daughters of noble houses surrounding the ceremony, she wore no crown, no embroidered silk, and no expensive gemstones. She was only an Omega. A quiet girl many believed should never have been chosen by fate to stand before a king. The high priest raised the moonstone high into the sunlight. Its pale glow washed across the sacred circle until it reached both of them. The entire kingdom waited for the blessing that would bind their souls forever. Instead, silence spread across the courtyard. Magnus Wolf remained perfectly still. Then the king took one deliberate step backward. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The high priest frowned. "Your Majesty." Magnus' voice rang clear across the ceremony grounds. "The moon has made a mistake." The word struck harder than any weapon ever could. Whispers exploded like wildfire. Rejected. Impossible. Cursed. Worthless Omega. Maeve felt every stare burning into her skin, yet she refused to lower her head. Her wolf whimpered deep inside her heart, not because of the rejection itself, but because she already knew what would happen next. She had lived this moment before. The accusations came exactly as they had in another lifetime. Someone shouted that her presence had offended the moon goddess. Another claimed she had deceived the kingdom. Fear spread faster than reason. Faces she once trusted turned away. Even the morning sky seemed darker than it had only moments before. She searched Magnus' face one last time. In her first life, she had begged him to believe her. She had pleaded until her voice disappeared beneath the judgment of the court. None of it had mattered. By sunset, everything she loved had been taken from her. But the final memory was not the rejection. It was Magnus running through the palace gates long after it was too late, his eyes filled with a grief that could never undo what had already happened. She remembered him calling her name with a desperation she had never heard before. She remembered reaching toward him as darkness swallowed every sound. Then, silence. A single breath entered her lungs. Maeve's eyes flew open. She gasped sharply and sat upright in a small wooden bed as morning sunlight spilled through the narrow window of her modest room. Her heart pounded so violently she pressed both hands against her chest. Outside, distant cathedral bells rang once, twice, 3 times. The sacred mate ceremony would begin in exactly 2 hours. She looked down at her trembling hands. They were warm. Alive. No chains. No frightened crowd. No judgment. Only another chance. Tears gathered in her eyes before she quietly wiped them away. "Not again," she whispered into the empty room, her voice steadier than she expected. "This time. I won't stand in that circle." Far away inside the royal palace, Alpha King Magnus suddenly paused in the middle of fastening his black armor. Without warning, an unbearable ache tightened around his heart. His wolf stirred uneasily beneath his calm expression, whispering one impossible feeling that made no sense at all. "Don't lose her." Maeve wrapped a plain wool cloak around her shoulders and slipped quietly through the servant entrance before the palace bells announced the beginning of the sacred mate ceremony. Every step away from the cathedral felt like defying destiny itself, yet every memory hidden inside her heart reminded her that obedience had once led only to sorrow. The narrow streets of the capital slowly filled with excited citizens carrying flowers and silver ribbons, laughing as they hurried toward the sacred square. None of them noticed the young Omega walking in the opposite direction. That alone was different. In her first life, she had been surrounded by attendants preparing her for a ceremony everyone believed would change history. This morning, history was unfolding without her. As she crossed the old stone bridge leading toward the eastern gate, an elderly flower merchant struggled to lift a heavy wooden cart after one became trapped between cracked paving stones. Without hesitation, Maeve stepped forward and pushed beside her. The cart rolled free with a soft scrape. The woman smiled warmly and pressed a single white moon lily into Maeve's hand. "May the moon bless your journey, child," she whispered. The simple kindness tightened something deep inside Maeve's chest. In her first life, she had been too consumed by fear to notice small moments like this. Perhaps changing fate did not always begin with grand choices. Perhaps it began with choosing compassion instead of despair. At the royal cathedral, confusion spread through the gathering crowd. The sacred circle remained empty. Nobles exchanged uneasy glances while the high priest quietly ordered additional messengers to search every chamber within the palace. Alpha King Magnus stood motionless beneath the towering marble pillars, yet an unfamiliar restlessness stirred beneath his composed expression. His wolf paced endlessly inside his mind. She should be here. Find her. The command repeated again and again without reason. Magnus frowned. It was impossible. The moon bond had not formed. No sacred vow had been spoken. Why, then, did absence feel heavier than presence? Across the courtyard, Lady Celine Whitmore lowered her eyes to conceal the brief satisfaction flashing across her face. Everything was proceeding differently than expected, but perhaps differently could still become useful. Quietly she slipped away before anyone noticed her disappearance. Far beyond the city walls, Maeve reached an abandoned hillside chapel overlooking miles of golden fields shimmering beneath the late morning sun. She had come here only once before, years earlier as a child with her parents. The little sanctuary had long been forgotten by the kingdom, yet its weathered stone still carried the carved symbol of the moon goddess above the entrance. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight as Maeve stepped inside. The silence felt peaceful rather than lonely. She knelt before the ancient altar and closed her eyes. "I am not asking for another miracle," she whispered softly. "I am only asking for the strength not to repeat my own mistakes." At that exact moment, a faint silver glow spread beneath her fingertips across the worn stone. Startled, she pulled her hand away, but the light lingered for one quiet heartbeat before disappearing completely. She stared at the altar in disbelief. That had never happened before. Somewhere outside, hurried footsteps echoed across the hillside. A deep voice called into the empty chapel, calm yet urgent. "If someone is here, please answer. I have been searching since sunrise." Maeve recognized that voice instantly. Brennan Hale, the Alpha King's most loyal captain, had somehow found the one place no one else remembered existed. Maeve's breath caught as Brennan Hale stepped through the weathered doorway, sunlight outlining the broad frame of the Alpha King's most trusted captain. His steel-gray cloak was dusted with the pale earth of hurried travel, yet his steady eyes carried neither accusation nor hostility. They carried only confusion. "Lady Maeve," he said carefully, lowering his head with unexpected respect. "The entire palace is searching for you." She remained still beside the ancient altar, every instinct urging her to flee before history could tighten its grip once again. In her first life, Brennan had escorted her back to the cathedral believing he was protecting the kingdom. Days later, he had stood silently among the royal guard, unable to stop the tragedy that followed. She had never blamed him. He had simply trusted the wrong voices. "I am not returning," Maeve answered quietly. Brennan studied her face. Something was different. He remembered an Omega who had always greeted others with gentle uncertainty, but the woman standing before him now possessed a calm that belonged to someone who had already survived an impossible storm. "May I ask why?" he said. Maeve looked toward the faded symbol of the moon goddess carved above the altar. "Because some paths only lead to regret." Brennan frowned, unable to understand the weight hidden inside such simple words. Before he could speak again, a cold gust swept through the abandoned chapel. Every candle resting on the forgotten stone shelves flickered to life without a single hand touching them. Their silver flames burned silently, casting shifting light across walls untouched for generations. Brennan instinctively stepped back. "By the moon," he whispered. Maeve slowly turned toward the altar. Thin lines of silver radiance spread across the ancient stone once more, weaving together into the shape of a crescent unlike any royal crest she had ever seen. A distant memory stirred inside her, not from her first life, but from childhood. Her mother had once spoken of forgotten sanctuaries where the moon goddess answered only those carrying a promise older than the kingdom itself. She had dismissed it as a bedtime tale. Now the forgotten story no longer seemed impossible. Hundreds of miles away inside the royal palace, Alpha King Magnus stood alone in the Hall of Ancestors after dismissing every advisor. The empty ceremonial throne offered him no comfort. His wolf refused to settle. Images flashed across his mind without warning. A pair of trembling hands slipping away from his grasp. A field covered in white moon lilies bending beneath a cold wind. A woman's voice calling his name from somewhere he could never reach. The visions vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving only a crushing emptiness. Magnus closed his eyes. "Who are you?" he murmured to the unseen presence haunting his thoughts. His wolf answered with one desperate word. "Mate." Magnus opened his eyes immediately. Impossible. The sacred ceremony had never been completed. The bond should not exist. Yet the ache inside his soul only deepened. At the chapel, Brennan slowly approached the glowing altar, careful not to disturb whatever ancient force had awakened. "This place has been abandoned for over 200 years, he said. "No one has reported anything like this in our kingdom's history." Maeve reached toward the fading light but stopped inches away. Fear no longer controlled her decisions, yet caution remained. Every change in the timeline carried consequences she could not predict. If this sanctuary had remained silent during her first life, why had it answered her now? Then she noticed something neither of them had seen before. Hidden beneath centuries of dust at the base of the altar rested a narrow stone compartment, now standing slightly open as though unlocked from within. Inside lay a single weathered scroll wrapped with silver thread bearing the same crescent symbol that had appeared beneath her hand. Brennan stared at it in stunned silence. "Someone hid this here long before either of us was born," he said softly. Maeve's heartbeat quickened. She reached toward the forgotten scroll with trembling fingers, unaware that far beyond the chapel walls, another pair of unseen eyes had already witnessed the silver light rising into the morning sky, and Cedric Thorne finally realized that fate itself had begun to change. Maeve carefully lifted the weathered scroll from the hidden compartment, surprised that the fragile parchment did not crumble beneath her fingertips. The silver thread unwound by itself, falling gently across the ancient altar as though an invisible hand had released it. Symbols unlike any royal script shimmered faintly across the page before slowly transforming into words she could understand. Brennan watched in astonishment. "Can you read it?" he asked quietly. Maeve nodded almost without realizing it. The blood remembered what the mind forgot, she whispered as the first lines settled into clear language before her eyes. The message spoke of a forgotten covenant between the moon goddess and a family chosen not to rule kingdoms but to preserve hope whenever darkness threatened to consume them. Their gift was never meant to command armies or claim thrones. Their purpose was to restore balance when fear blinded even the wisest rulers. Maeve's pulse quickened. Nothing like this had existed in her first life. Or perhaps it had always existed, hidden beyond the path she had been allowed to walk. Brennan leaned closer, but the glowing words slowly faded from the parchment until only blank pages remained. He looked at the empty scroll in disbelief. It disappeared. Maeve slowly rolled the parchment closed. "No," she replied softly. "It simply was not meant for every pair of eyes." Outside, the peaceful silence of the hillside vanished as distant church bells announced the official conclusion of the sacred mate ceremony. The kingdom would already know that the future everyone expected had unraveled. Somewhere beyond those rolling fields, frightened rumors were beginning to spread through villages, marketplaces, and noble estates alike. A rejected ceremony was not merely a failed tradition. To many, it was an omen. At the royal palace, advisors crowded the council chamber, each offering explanations that sounded increasingly desperate. Some blamed the moon goddess. Others questioned the ancient rituals themselves. Cedric Thorne remained unusually calm. He listened to every fearful voice while quietly guiding each conversation toward the same conclusion. The kingdom requires certainty, he said in a measured tone. If confusion continues, people will search for someone to blame. Several council members nodded uneasily. Cedric lowered his gaze to hide the satisfaction flickering across his expression. The timeline had shifted beyond anything he expected, but chaos could still become an ally. Meanwhile, Magnus stood alone on the palace balcony overlooking the city. The celebration banners now hung motionless beneath gray clouds that had gathered without warning. He could not explain why every passing minute intensified the strange emptiness inside him. Closing his eyes, he allowed his wolf to surface. Instead of answers, another unfamiliar image flashed across his thoughts. A quiet hillside chapel. Silver light dancing across forgotten stone. A young woman standing before an ancient altar with tears she refused to shed. Magnus opened his eyes sharply. The vision disappeared, but one detail remained painfully clear. He had never visited that place, yet somehow he knew it existed. "Prepare my horse," he ordered the nearest guard. "Your Majesty," the soldier asked with surprise. Immediately. Back inside the abandoned chapel, Maeve folded the mysterious scroll into her satchel. She had changed one decision, yet the world itself seemed to be responding in ways she had never imagined. In her first life she had believed survival depended upon avoiding danger. Now she began to understand that survival alone would never be enough. The truth hidden beneath centuries of silence had already begun calling her forward. As she and Brennan stepped outside, a flock of white birds suddenly rose from the ancient bell tower, circling once above the chapel before flying toward the distant mountains instead of the capital. Brennan followed their flight with narrowed eyes. "That is strange," he murmured. "Those birds always migrate south this time of year." Maeve watched them disappear beyond the horizon as an uneasy certainty settled into her heart. The future was no longer repeating itself. It was creating an entirely new path. Far away, concealed among the trees overlooking the chapel, an unknown rider quietly turned his horse and disappeared into the forest carrying news that someone had awakened the forgotten sanctuary before the Alpha King could ever reach it. Maeve and Brennan followed the narrow trail descending from the forgotten chapel until the distant sounds of the capital faded behind rustling trees and flowing water. For the first time since awakening in this second chance at life, Maeve allowed herself to breathe without expecting disaster to arrive with the next heartbeat. Yet peace refused to settle inside her completely. Every new choice seemed to awaken another hidden thread of fate. The mysterious scroll rested securely inside her satchel, but she could still feel a faint warmth radiating through the fabric, as though the ancient words had not vanished at all. They had simply become part of her journey. Brennan finally broke the silence. "I have served the royal family for nearly 15 years. I have seen sacred relics, ancient ceremonies, and miracles that most people believe exist only in legends. But I have never witnessed a forgotten sanctuary answer someone the way it answered you." Maeve lowered her eyes. "Neither have I." She did not tell him that in another lifetime the sanctuary had remained hidden forever because she had never lived long enough to find it. Ahead, the trail opened into a small farming village where worried families had gathered beside the community well. Several children carried empty baskets while older farmers spoke in anxious voices about an illness spreading through nearby livestock. Their harvest festival had been cancelled, and fear had begun replacing hope. Maeve recognized the village immediately. During her first life she had never stopped here. Weeks later she had heard that many families had abandoned their homes after losing nearly everything. This time she quietly walked toward an elderly woman struggling to comfort a frightened little boy whose hands trembled as he held a weak newborn lamb. The animal breathed softly but refused to stand. Maeve knelt without hesitation. She gently placed one hand upon the lamb while speaking calmly to the child instead of the frightened adults surrounding them. Sometimes even the smallest heart only needs patience before it remembers its own strength. The faint warmth she had felt from the scroll spread through her fingertips. It was not a brilliant light nor a dramatic miracle. It felt more like the comforting warmth of early morning sunshine after a long winter night. Moments later the lamb slowly lifted its head, blinked, and carefully found its footing. A surprised laugh escaped the little boy as the animal took several steady steps toward him. The villagers exchanged astonished glances. No one called it magic. No one declared it impossible. They simply smiled with relief. The elderly woman reached for Maeve's hands with grateful eyes. "You brought hope when we believed none remained." Those simple words echoed through Maeve's heart more deeply than any royal title ever could. Nearby, Brennan observed everything in thoughtful silence. He had expected to escort a frightened Omega back to the palace. Instead he was witnessing strangers instinctively trust someone the kingdom had already begun blaming for its uncertainty. At the royal palace, Magnus suddenly stopped while mounting his horse. An unfamiliar feeling of quiet warmth brushed against the emptiness inside him, lasting only a heartbeat before fading again. His wolf immediately lifted its head. "She is safe." Magnus frowned. He still could not understand why those words felt undeniably true. Behind the windows of the council chamber, Cedric Thorne watched the king ride toward the eastern countryside. A messenger quietly approached and whispered into his ear. Cedric's expression remained calm, but his fingers tightened around the carved wooden cane resting beside him. "The sanctuary has awakened," the messenger murmured. Cedric dismissed him with a slight nod before looking toward the distant hills beyond the capital. "So the game has changed," he said softly to himself. "Then the first move belongs to her. The second will belong to me." That evening the western sky glowed with streaks of amber as Maeve and Brennan remained in the quiet village, helping families prepare food, gather clean water, and calm frightened children whose parents feared the uncertain days ahead. No one asked whether she belonged to the royal court. No one questioned why an Omega dressed in plain linen carried herself with quiet confidence. They only saw someone willing to stay when others hurried away. As twilight settled over the fields, the elderly woman who had welcomed Maeve earlier approached with a small wooden box wrapped in faded blue cloth. "This belonged to my grandmother," she said gently. "She always believed someone would come looking for it one day." Curious, Maeve accepted the box and carefully lifted the lid. Inside rested an old silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon embracing a single tiny star. The moment her fingers brushed the cool metal, the familiar warmth from the hidden scroll answered again. A soft pulse spread through her palm before fading into silence. Brennan noticed the change immediately. "That symbol," he said thoughtfully. "I have seen it once before." Maeve looked up. "Where?" "In the oldest wing of the royal archives. It was carved into a sealed stone doorway that no scholar has ever managed to open." Before either of them could say more, the village bell rang unexpectedly. A young messenger rode into the square, breathing heavily after a long journey. "Royal announcement," he called. "By order of the council, every village is to report unusual events, unexplained lights, forgotten relics, or anyone connected to today's broken ceremony." Uneasy murmurs spread through the crowd. The messenger continued reading from the parchment without noticing Maeve standing only a few yards away. "Any information leading to clarification of today's sacred disturbance will be rewarded by the crown." Maeve felt her heart tighten. The wording sounded official, yet something about it felt wrong. In her first life, the kingdom had searched for someone to blame. This time they claimed to be searching for answers. The difference seemed small, but experience had taught her that words often shaped destiny long before actions did. Brennan quietly folded his arms. The king would never choose those exact words. Maeve met his eyes. Then someone else wrote them. Hundreds of miles away, Magnus guided his horse through the forest trails leading east. Every mile strengthened the strange pull drawing him forward. As darkness settled across the trees, he reached a narrow ridge overlooking the forgotten chapel. His horse suddenly stopped without command. The Alpha King lifted his eyes and stared in silent disbelief. Silver light shimmered briefly above the ancient bell tower before disappearing into the stars like the last ember of a distant fire. His wolf surged with unmistakable certainty. She was here. Only moments too late. Magnus urged his horse forward, but the sanctuary already stood empty. He stepped inside and found only cold stone, extinguished candles, and the faint scent of wild moon lilies lingering in the quiet air. Without understanding why, he rested one hand upon the ancient altar. A single image flashed across his mind. Maeve standing exactly where he now stood, looking toward him with sadness rather than anger. The vision vanished instantly, leaving behind only one whispered sentence echoing inside his soul. "You finally came, just not in time." Magnus slowly lowered his hand, shaken by emotions he could neither explain nor dismiss. Hidden deep within the palace, Cedric Thorne unfolded an ancient map marked with forgotten sanctuaries scattered across the kingdom. One location had begun glowing with faint silver ink while another, far beyond the northern mountains, had just awakened with the same mysterious light. Cedric smiled without warmth. "So there was never only one heir," he murmured. "And now the race has truly begun." The following morning arrived beneath a sky washed in pale silver, and for the first time since her return to this life, Maeve felt that the future no longer belonged entirely to fear. She fastened the crescent pendant around her neck before stepping outside the small cottage where the villagers had offered her shelter. The moment the pendant rested against her heart, it released a gentle warmth that matched the quiet rhythm she had first felt inside the forgotten sanctuary. Brennan noticed it immediately but asked no questions. He had begun to understand that some answers revealed themselves only when the time was right. Instead, he unfolded an old map across a wooden table. "The royal archives are 2 days south," he said. "If the symbol on your pendant truly matches the sealed chamber, we may finally learn why the sanctuary awakened for you." Maeve looked toward the distant mountains glowing beneath the morning light. In her first life, she had spent every day reacting to disasters she never saw coming. This time she wanted to move before fate forced her to. She nodded. "Then we leave today." Before they could begin their journey, hurried footsteps echoed through the village square. The same young messenger who had delivered the royal proclamation the previous evening returned with another scroll, his face pale with concern. "The council has announced that unusual moon signs have now appeared in several regions across the kingdom," he called. "Travelers are advised to avoid abandoned shrines and ancient ruins until further notice." Villagers exchanged uneasy glances, but Maeve felt something entirely different. In her first life, there had been only silence before everything collapsed. Now the kingdom itself was awakening, as though hidden pieces of an ancient promise were answering one another across the land. Brennan quietly folded the proclamation after reading it. "Someone is trying to keep people away from those sanctuaries." Maeve met his eyes. "Because they do not want anyone discovering what has been hidden." Far away inside the royal archives, Alpha King Magnus stood before the sealed stone doorway Brennan had described. The ancient crescent symbol carved into its surface had remained cold and lifeless for generations. Yet as Magnus stepped closer, faint silver lines slowly appeared within the stone before fading again. The royal scholars stared in disbelief. "It has never reacted before," one elderly historian whispered. Magnus reached toward the carving, but the moment his fingers touched the stone, another fragment of memory flashed across his mind. He saw Maeve smiling softly while placing a silver pendant around the neck of a frightened child. The image disappeared almost instantly, replaced by a powerful certainty that he had once known her kindness long before the ceremony that had never happened. His wolf stirred with growing urgency. "Find her before someone else does." At nearly the same moment, Cedric Thorne welcomed a hooded visitor into a private chamber hidden beneath the council hall. The stranger quietly placed an aged journal upon the table. Cedric opened it with careful hands, revealing faded illustrations of the same crescent pendant now resting against Maeve's heart. Beneath the drawing appeared a single warning written centuries earlier. "When the last moon heir awakens, the forgotten gates shall answer only truth." Cedric slowly closed the journal. For the first time, confidence slipped from his expression. He had planned for politics, influence, and fear. He had not planned for ancient promises beyond his control. Back in the village, Maeve tightened the straps of her satchel, feeling the hidden scroll and pendant gently warming together as though guiding her toward a destination neither map nor memory could fully reveal. She took one final look at the peaceful families she had helped, silently promising herself that no matter what awaited beyond the horizon, she would never again allow fear to decide her path. As she and Brennan disappeared into the forest road leading south, neither of them noticed the white wolf standing silently atop a distant ridge, watching their departure with pale gray eyes that reflected not hunger, but recognition. The forest road stretched south beneath towering pines whose branches filtered the afternoon sunlight into ribbons of silver and gold. Maeve walked with quiet determination, the crescent pendant resting against her heart and the hidden scroll secured safely inside her satchel. Every few miles she expected another memory from her first life to surface, yet instead she found something stranger. The road itself no longer felt familiar. Small details had changed. A wooden bridge that had once collapsed years earlier now stood newly repaired. A family she remembered abandoning their farms still worked peacefully in their fields. The timeline was not simply changing. It was healing in places where despair had once taken root. Brennan noticed the thoughtful expression crossing her face. "You are seeing something I cannot, are you not?" he asked gently. Maeve smiled faintly. "I am realizing that every choice creates more than one future." Before Brennan could reply, voices drifted from farther down the road. A merchant wagon had stopped beside a shallow stream where several travelers struggled to lift a broken wheel back onto its axle. Their supplies were scattered across the grass, and frustration had begun replacing patience. Without hesitation, Maeve stepped forward to help gather the fallen bundles while Brennan joined the men attempting to steady the wagon. As Maeve lifted a small wooden chest, she noticed an elderly scholar kneeling beside a stack of weathered books, carefully brushing dust from their worn leather covers. One volume immediately caught her attention. Its faded binding carried the same crescent symbol engraved upon her pendant. The old man followed her gaze and smiled with quiet surprise. "Very few recognize that mark anymore," he said. "It belongs to stories most kingdoms chose to forget." Maeve carefully asked, "May I see the book?" The scholar handed it to her without hesitation. As soon as her fingers touched the cover, the pages fluttered open by themselves until they stopped at a hand-drawn illustration showing 7 ancient sanctuaries connected by silver lines stretching across a map of the kingdom. At the center of every line appeared one sentence written in elegant script. "Hope cannot be commanded. It must be awakened." Maeve felt her heartbeat quicken. This was the second time forgotten knowledge had revealed itself only after she touched it. The scholar studied her carefully. "Interesting," he murmured. "The pages have not opened on their own for decades." Before Maeve could ask another question, hoofbeats echoed from the northern road. Several royal riders approached carrying the banner of the Alpha King. Brennan instinctively stepped forward, but the captain leading the patrol dismounted respectfully. "Captain Hale," he said with visible relief. "His Majesty has ordered every trusted officer to report immediately. The king has personally begun searching the eastern provinces after experiencing unusual visions." Brennan exchanged a brief glance with Maeve. "What kind of visions?" The rider hesitated. He did not explain. He only said he keeps arriving one step behind someone he feels he should have protected. Those words settled heavily over the quiet roadside. Maeve lowered her eyes, remembering the final moments of her first life and the grief she had seen on Magnus' face only after everything had already been lost. She had promised herself she would never depend upon him again, yet hearing that his heart still reached toward memories his mind could not understand awakened emotions she had tried to bury. Hundreds of miles away, Magnus stood before a large map inside the royal war chamber. One by one, silver lights appeared across its surface, marking forgotten sanctuaries that had slept for centuries. His wolf watched every glowing point before focusing upon one still dark location hidden beyond the southern forests. Without knowing why, Magnus placed his finger upon that silent place and whispered, "You are going there." At that exact moment, the pendant beneath Maeve's cloak grew warmer than ever before, and somewhere deep beneath the mountains far ahead, an ancient stone gate that had remained sealed for generations slowly began to unlock from within. By the time the first stars appeared above the southern mountains, Maeve and Brennan stood before a valley hidden from every map carried by the kingdom's travelers. Towering cliffs embraced the narrow entrance, and ancient white stone pillars rose from the earth like silent guardians waiting through forgotten centuries. The crescent pendant resting against Maeve's heart pulsed with a gentle rhythm that matched the steady beat of her own heart. The warmth was no longer asking her to continue. It was welcoming her home. Brennan studied the enormous stone gate built into the mountainside. Thick vines covered its weathered surface, yet beneath the moss and ivy, 7 silver crescents slowly emerged one after another until the entire gateway shimmered beneath the moonlight. "This place has been hidden in plain sight," Brennan whispered. No wonder no one believed the old stories. Maeve stepped closer, her fingers trembling slightly as memories from neither her first life nor her childhood brushed gently against her thoughts. They were older than both. She saw women dressed in simple gray robes carrying light instead of weapons. She saw kings kneeling before ordinary healers, not out of fear, but out of gratitude. She saw children laughing inside halls where no throne stood higher than compassion. The visions faded, leaving only a single truth resting quietly within her heart. Power had never been the purpose of her bloodline. Hope had been. As she placed her hand upon the center of the great stone gate, the silver crescents aligned with the pendant around her neck. A deep, resonant sound echoed through the valley as hidden mechanisms awakened for the first time in generations. The gate slowly opened inward, revealing a vast chamber illuminated by soft moonlight flowing through crystal openings in the ceiling. Ancient gardens still flourished inside, untouched by time. Clear water drifted peacefully through narrow channels carved into white stone, and at the center of the sanctuary stood a circular platform supporting a crystal taller than any person. It glowed gently, not with overwhelming brilliance, but with the quiet comfort of dawn after a long night. Brennan removed his gloves almost instinctively, overcome by reverence rather than surprise. "This place was never built to hide treasure," he murmured. "It was built to protect something far more valuable." As Maeve approached the crystal, the hidden scroll inside her satchel floated gently into the air before unfolding by itself. This time the silver words did not disappear. They circled the crystal like drifting stars until one final message settled clearly before her eyes. "The last moon heir does not inherit a crown. She awakens the light that allows every heart to choose truth over fear." Tears quietly filled Maeve's eyes. In her first life she had believed her greatest wish was to be believed. Now she understood something far greater. If truth itself could be restored, countless others would never suffer the same fate she once endured. Hundreds of miles away inside the royal palace, every silver light upon the ancient kingdom map suddenly joined together, forming a single radiant path stretching directly toward the southern sanctuary. Magnus stared at it in silence before his wolf surged with complete certainty. There was no hesitation left inside him. No lingering doubt. "Prepare the royal escort," he ordered firmly. "I am leaving before sunrise." Nearby, Alistair Voss, the royal healer, quietly studied the glowing map before looking toward the king. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "if the old prophecies are true, the person waiting at the end of that path will not need a ruler to save her." Magnus slowly fastened his crimson cloak across his shoulders. "I know," he answered with quiet conviction. "This time, I intend to become someone worthy of standing beside her." Hidden beneath the council hall, Cedric Thorne watched every sanctuary on his own ancient map ignite with silver light except one final marked position directly beneath the royal capital itself. His expression darkened as he realized the last secret had remained beneath his feet all along. He reached toward the final symbol, but before his fingers touched the parchment, the mark vanished completely, leaving behind only 4 words written in silver that had never appeared before. "Hope has already chosen."